Hello there.
Good morning. Good morning. All right. Welcome to Daf Yomi Week in Review, first week in Ketubot. I'm Rachel Scheinerman. This is My Jewish Learning, and we're joined by Rabbi Elliot Goldberg.
Hi. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. We started Masechet Ketubot this week, which if you've been waiting for a new Masechet, this is it. Oh, I already saw woot woot in the text, and I'm seeing some smiles. I feel that way too. Masechet Ketubot, its major theme is about weddings and marriages, right? The word ketubah is about the marriage contract, and ketubot, to a large extent, is about the institution of marriage in the rabbinic legal system and the contract between husband and wife and all the particulars of that. If you're familiar with Talmud, if you've been reading Daf Yomi, you know that just because a Masechet has a particular theme doesn't mean every passage in the Masechet is about that theme. And actually, Masechet Ketubot is referred to by some of the later commentators as a Shas Katan, like a mini Talmud. And they call it the mini Talmud, or some call it like an index of the Talmud, because as you study Masechet Ketubot as a whole, it's known for touching on topics from all over the Talmud. Now, as I say that, I think to myself, well, that's true of the whole Talmud, because the whole Talmud is self-referential and always referring to other places. But there's a way in which Masechet Ketubot is even more that for the Talmud, and in the breadth of topics that come up as supporting texts or tangents or conversations. In addition to learning about like the Ketubah and the marriage contract itself, the rabbis labeled this, the commentators labeled this Shas Katana mini Talmud, because if you study Ketubot, you really get a taste for everything else in the Talmud, and far more so than any other Masechet. And what I thought we would do this morning is look at some of the passages that we saw in this week that come from other places. And, Rachel, can you do me a favor and drop the link?
Yep. So here's the source sheet.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. So in the chat, you could find a source sheet that has the sources we're going to look at today. And I'm going to take you through them. You can open up that link. It should give you access to the document. I see people going there on their screens. Can someone give me a thumbs up if the document opens? Oh, good. So the settings, I always worry that like I linked it, but didn't give you permission to see it. So thank you for that thumbs up.
Rabbi Goldberg, it might make sense also for you to screen share it and show which part of the document you're on as we go.
I could do that as well.
That way, also, if people are on their phone and can't open a second screen.
Yes. All right. I am opening it up as well. That will let me add the missing S in the header as well. All right. I'm going to screen share. Here we go. And I'm going to take you through the text. So part of what I would love, what we're going to look at is each of the texts, talk a little bit about the context that we find it in Masechet Ketubot, but also focus on the place that the text is from and the other information that we learn when we study Masechet Ketubot. So I'm going to start with the first Mishnah, which began the Masechet, and just the first topic in it. I narrowed it down to one topic a little bit. You'll see the ellipsis in the text. The Mishnah teaches a virgin is married on Wednesday because twice a week courts convene in towns on Monday and Thursday, so that if the husband has a claim concerning his bride's virginity, when consummating the marriage on a Wednesday night, he could go to the court early the next day to make his claim. So we learn at the beginning of Ketubot about some of the about the guarantees of the ketubah. The ketubah guarantees certain amounts of money upon if a marriage were to dissolve by divorce or death of the husband to the wife, and the amount of money is dependent on the status of the woman in the rabbinic legal system. And a woman who was a virgin has a higher price than someone who's been married before. So that's why a husband might make a claim about the virginity of his new bride because he might think that the terms of the contract have been violated. So in addition to delving into, when the opening discussion digs into when marriages happen, but there's also a conversation that emerges about the courts themselves and when courts meet. So I'm going to go to source 1b from a little bit later. Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak said, the sages teach that this halacha is in effect only from the institution of the ordinance of Ezra, that the courts are regularly in session only on Monday and Thursday. Right? Ezra has a book named after him in the Bible. He was in the biblical record, names him as a leader of the Jewish people upon the return from the Babylonian exile to Israel. And Ezra is known in rabbinic literature for establishing many ordinances that would help set up how Jewish life was going to be and what society would look like in Israel after they returned. And with the return, Ezra decreed the courts meet on Mondays and Thursdays, which coincide with market days, right? The days people from far and wide came into the center of town. And the courts met then, so it made sense that the courts would meet on the days that were market days when people were around. And in Ketubah, we learned that the timing of the court lined up with the time when weddings would happen. But the Gemara's discussion continues by saying, wait, prior to the ordinance of Ezra, I'm sorry. I think I lost the line of the text. Oh, sorry. However, the text said, prior to the ordinance of Ezra, when courts were in regular session every day, a woman could be married on any day of the week. So the Gemara points out that when courts met after the time of Ezra, they met on Mondays and Thursdays, it limited when weddings would take place for women who are getting married for the first time. But that prior to the time of Ezra, it just notes that weddings happened every day because the courts met every day. The Gemara objects in its way. Wait, prior to the institution of Ezra, sort of says, who cares what happened in the past? What was past was in the past. Like, we don't need to talk about the past. There's no reason to bring that up here. We know courts meet Mondays and Thursdays. So because Thursdays is a court day, Wednesday is the wedding day. We might come back to it a little later, but there's other reasons why Sunday weddings don't happen, even though there's a Monday court day. But anyways, they say we don't have to worry about the past. Why bring up that before Ezra something was different? And then the Gemara says, well, this is why Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak is teaching this, because he says if there are courts in regular daily sessions today, like there were prior to Ezra, then a woman can get married on any day of the week. So the historical precedent is important should the ordinance of Ezra change. When rabbinic courts meet Monday and Thursday, it means Wednesday is the day for women to get married or getting married for the first time. But if that should change, we could also go back and change the days where women get married. So this snippet of Gemara coming from the Mishnah is part of a larger discussion about when weddings can take place. But it's also a piece that touches on what we're going to focus on when we get to Masachet Sanhedrin later on, which talks about what are courts like, when do they meet, how many judges sit on the court, who's eligible to be a judge. We get a little snippet of Masachet Sanhedrin here, right at the beginning of Masachet Ketubot. So that's source number one, and other Masachet number one, building the case for why Masachet Ketubot is called like the mini Talmud. Source number two goes to a different place, and here we're going to touch on divorce, Masachet Gitin. it's interesting to me in the first pages of talking about the marriage contract, the rabbis are already introducing an aside about divorce. But there's a section that we read this week where we read a rabbinic statement that says there's no bill of divorce posthumously, meaning you can't create a legal document to make a divorce happen after the death of the husband. And the Gemara explains that a little more here. It was taught in the Mishnah that if a husband said on his deathbed to his wife, right, a husband is dying or ill and dying, and he says to his wife, here, I'm giving you this bill of divorce if I die, meaning it's a conditional document. Like, here's your bill of divorce, and if I die, then we'll be divorced. Or this is your bill of divorce if I die from this illness. Or this is your bill of divorce after I die. Right? He said nothing. This is in some parts contract law, but in some parts divorce law that says a husband can't give his wife a document that's conditional upon his death. Meaning, if he's sick and wants to divorce his wife so that they could separate before he dies, that's okay. But if he gives her a conditional document that says, this is a divorce document, but it only becomes valid when I die, that's not a valid document. And by giving her that document, it doesn't have any legal significance. And we encountered this text as an aside in the conversations at the beginning of the Masechet, and it's a glimpse of what we'll see not too far ahead when we get to Masechet Gittin about what conditions, when you can make conditions in a divorce document and when you can't. And actually, our little foray into Gittin, into divorce law, is longer than the snippet, but given that we're only get together for a half hour this morning, I only gave you one piece. There's even more of Gittin here on page 2 of Ketubot to let you see what's here. So that's Masechet number 2, a glimpse of Sanhedrin, excuse me, and a glimpse of Gittin. And then the next source, we're going to revisit Masechet Shabbat, which if you've been with us in Daf Yomi since the beginning, you might see some familiar things here and maybe some new things as well. So part of this is really a tangent in the conversation, but the beginning of Ketubot references something that comes up a lot in Masechet Shabbat. Rabbi Shimon teaches an unintentional act is permitted on Shabbat, meaning we learned when we study Masechet Shabbat, there are all kinds of things that you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. But it's about the forbidden labors are intentional. You have to be intentional about doing it. If you do something unintentionally, you don't mean to, but it happens. You trip and fall and accidentally strike a match and it lands in some wood and a fire starts. You haven't broken the prohibition of lighting a fire because you didn't do it intentionally. You didn't mean for it to happen. You sort of fell and a fire happened. Or something like that. That's not the best example. I don't know that can really happen in real life, but you get my point, I hope. And in response to Rabbi Shimon, there's a psik reshe below nafkale. The Gemara says, I gave it to you in English here. If you cut off the head, will it not die? It's a little cryptic Gemara, if you remember from Masechet Shabbat. It's an alternate position to Rabbi Shimon that says, if you have a chicken and you were to be, and you cut off its head, aren't you guaranteeing that it dies? And the logic, what that says is, there's nothing wrong with cutting off a limb, cutting off a piece of a chicken, but on Shabbat, but you're not supposed to kill a chicken on Shabbat. So here, this is the way the rabbi is saying, like, talking about an unintentional act with definite consequences that will always happen. Meaning, you could apply Rabbi Shimon's logic is, I'm trying to cut off a head off a chicken. I'm not trying to kill the chicken, and the death is unintentional, and it should be okay for me to cut a head off a chicken. But the rabbinic logic says, when you cut a head off a chicken, it will definitely die. Cutting off the head of the chicken is not an intentional act. Now, in our day, we're not, unless you're working with chickens or in a kosher meat factory. We don't cut off heads of chickens a lot in our day-to-day lives or even on Shabbat as a whole. Although those of you that do, you'll tell me in the chat, no, I do this all the time. But it's the rabbi's way of saying that there are definite consequences that will emerge from something. And so you can't say those consequences are unintentional. And some of the conversation that we have at the beginning of Masechet Ketubot references this debate, which is an echo back to Masechet Shabbat, which we saw before. And it comes in the context of another conversation about Shabbat, which has to do with like, what are you allowed and not allowed to do on Shabbat? That emerges from a discussion about can you get married on Friday? Can you get married Saturday night? And that conversation has to do with, does getting married right before, right after Shabbat put you at risk of breaking Shabbat? And that's where the last conversation comes from, and that's where this next conversation comes from too. Rabbi Zera teaches us that you can't get married Saturday night, which is the hook to Masechet Ketubot, because you might end up doing calculations connected to the wedding on Shabbat itself, right? If you've planned a wedding or a bar mitzvah or a birthday party or anything, sometimes there are last minute things you have to do. And if the wedding is Saturday night, you might be tempted to do some of those calculations, do some math, do some business, do some planning on Shabbat. And Rabbi Zera says no wedding Saturday night because he doesn't want people to end up doing calculations on Shabbat itself. And Abai says to him, wait, but are calculations that are connected to a mitzvah really prohibited on Shabbat? And he provides a whole list of things that Rav Chisda and Rav Huna and others teach, saying, here are things you can do on Shabbat. Rav Chisda and Rav Huna say, with regard to calculations for mitzvah, it's permitted to do them on Shabbat. And we add to that, Rabbi Elazar says, you can give tzedakah, you can allocate tzedakah on Shabbat. You can't actually give the money, but you can allocate money for tzedakah. Rabbi Yaakov said that Rabbi Yochanan said one goes to synagogue and study halls in order to supervise matters affecting the multitudes on Shabbat, meaning if there's a community crisis, right? If a storm came through on Shabbat and there was a hurricane and the town was knocked down, you can gather at a public place on Shabbat to help deal with the public need. Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi said that Rabbi Yochanan said, right? You can organize, supervise things that you need to do to save someone's life on Shabbat. Excuse me. The next paragraph adds more to that. Just watching the time, I'm going to skip over that. You can read that on your own. But so in response to Rabbi Zera, there's a whole list of things that says, well, you can do certain calculations for a mitzvah on Shabbat. And since getting married is a mitzvah, maybe it's okay to do calculations on Shabbat. And this isn't the reason to prohibit weddings Saturday night. And the Gemara goes to a different example. Rabbi Zera says, well, you can't get married Saturday night because you might slaughter a young fowl on Shabbat, intending to eat it at the wedding feast. And you're not allowed to slaughter animals for consumption after Shabbat on Shabbat. Excuse me just a second. Thanks. So here's a whole piece where the conversation in Ketubot is about, can you have a wedding on Saturday night? Why or why not? And in the exploring that, we see two different conversations about Shabbat. One about what are business-like things that you can actually do on Shabbat. One about unintended consequences of, unintentional actions on Shabbat, or unintended consequences, but definite consequences of intended actions on Shabbat. So in this segment, we get a little hearkening back to Masechet Shabbat, which we learned, feels like just yesterday, but it was probably like a year or two ago. I don't know. Daf Yomi, for me, it goes fast and slow at the same time.
2 years ago.
2 years ago. Thank you.
It was summer 2020.
Oh, there you go.
I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, folks, but I think it was 2 years.
I would trust you on that. Thanks. All right. Next, this goes way back to the beginning. We have also in these opening pages, also beginning with a discussion about marriage, about what a groom is exempt from on the night he gets married or in the first days of marriage. And it veers into a little bit about what mourners are exempt from doing. So it's a taste of both Masachet Brachot and a taste of Masachet Moed Katan, where they talk about the laws of mourning in Moed Katan, in a connected section of what we saw this week. The text there says, a groom is exempt from the mitzvah of reciting the Shema on the first night of his marriage to a virgin on Wednesday night, all the way up until Shabbat, if he has not taken action to consummate his marriage. Meaning the rabbis exempt the groom from his tefillah, right, his prayer responsibilities, while he has the mitzvah of consummating his marriage, so he shouldn't be distracted from consummating marriage, and he's relieved of having to say the Shema in the evening. We see a conversation about that here at the beginning of Ketubot and in Masachet Brachot also. And connected to that, there's also a longer piece that I just gave one snippet from in Ketubot about some things mourners are exempted from and some comparison between grooms and mourners and when we exempt. But Rav teaches that a mourner is obligated in all the mitzvot of the Torah except for the mitzvah to wear phylacteries, tefillin. As there's a reference in Ezekiel where the term splendor is stated related to tefillin. The verse is, make no mourning for the dead, bind your splendor upon yourself. Because of the juxtaposition of mourning for the dead and this piece about binding splendor onto yourself, the rabbi, right, and binding is the key to the reference to tefillin. The rabbis make a midrash halacha here, and they teach us when you're in mourning, right, the binding yourself with splendor wouldn't be appropriate, and so it's not. You don't wear tefillin while you're sitting shiva. That other mitzvot you have to do, but tefillin you're exempt from. And here, so in these sources and in the larger sugya here that's on page 6 of what we read this week, we hit both on laws of tefillah, Masachet Brachot, and some laws about mourning, Masachet Moed Katan. And the last text I only give you a little bit in the snippet here, but you could go back and look and see more. The Talmud in Masachet Ketubot brings us the text of all the wedding blessings. Right here, what I just gave you, as it's taught in another Braita, one recites the benediction of grooms in the house of grooms and a benediction of betrothal in the house of betrothal. It tells us where we say the different brachot, but on the page that follows, it lists the engagement brachot and the benediction of grooms, which now we call the wedding brachot. If you're caught up in Daf Yomi and you read this page, you will have seen that the brachot listed in the Talmud are almost exactly the brachot that we use today. And here in Masachet Ketubot, it gives us both the blessings for engagement and the blessings for the wedding and the rules about continuing to celebrate for 7 and 30 days after the wedding and how you keep saying these brachot. If you want to see the text of brachot, I think yesterday's Daf Yomi email talked about them. And you could also find them Ketubot 7b. But this is a glimpse of what's going to be in Masachet Kiddushin, because Masachet Kiddushin that's coming soon is about getting married, right? And more about all the pieces that go into the engagement and marriage itself. Where ostensibly Masachet Ketubot, which is related to that, is about the contract and the legal agreement. The topic of the celebration of weddings is in Masachet Kiddushin, which we have here in the first 7 pages. So you might be saying, and sometimes, as I thought about this today, like, well, I've been reading Daf Yomi for years now, and I know all the time the Gemara moves from the topic of the day to other topics. And this in and of itself doesn't prove that these texts in and of themselves don't prove that Masachet Ketubot is, a mini shas or like an index of the Talmud as a whole. But what I wanted to point out to you in this first week of Masachet Ketubot, so that you can open up, look for it, is the frequency with which Ketubot turns to other topics and the depth and breadth with which it engages in discussions that are from other Masechtot. And I hope that if we were to regroup on, after 100 pages of Masechet Ketubot, that you'll notice it's not just in these pages, and it's through the Masechet, and the intensity and the amount of information that you need to know from the rest of the Talmud is more pronounced in Masechet Ketubot. And in some ways, some of the Rishonim say we should actually study Masechet Ketubot first, because then you dive in, you learn all these other topics, and it's a good entryway that when you get to the rest of Masechet, you're already prepared to do that because Ketubot gave you the introduction. So let me pause here. I know we have a few minutes left. I'm going to stop the share and open back up the chat. But I wonder, Rachel, have you been watching that chat by any
I am.
chance to shout out some of the comments that we might want to address?
I actually think there's a question we should ask and discuss for a few minutes. It hasn't been addressed yet, which is why would Ketubot be the tractate? Maybe we can think about this together for a few minutes. Why would Ketubot be the tractate? You, me, and everybody else on the call, by us, I mean. Why would Ketubot be the tractate that's a mini Shas? That's a Shas, by the way, guys, is a acronym, Shisha Sidrei, right? Did I say that right? 6
Right,
orders.
Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, like the 6 orders of the Mishnah.
6 orders of the Mishnah and 6 orders of Talmud. This is short, rabbinic shorthand for Talmud. So why would it be Ketubot why is that the place where we are seeing everything come together? I think that's an interesting question to discuss. I'm curious what folks think. I don't have a canonical answer to that, but I'm curious what folks think about it.
Anybody want to hazard a hypothesis or a guess?
Okay, Sylvia says it is the core of family and the core of life, right? Okay, so the marriage, I guess, is the starting point of a new family.
Right. Yep. Now we have families, the unit, family unit, elevating marriage and the universe in it.
Yep.
Right.
Society and law.
We're getting some nice responses. I think it's a great question. I would say I did a little digging.
Yep. Sharna is saying the marriage between a man and a woman is like the marriage between God and the people of Israel. So there's a sacred component to marriage as well. Okay. Yoram points out that this is true to some degree in every Masechet.
Yes.
Yep. Michael is thinking along the same lines of Sharna, because the marriage between a man and a woman is reflecting the marriage between God and Israel.
Yeah. Right. Leah says, right, there's a piece of this about contract writing, difficulties and pitfalls, right? There's the wedding contract is a contract. So we didn't see that today. There'll be a lot about contract law, which is coming in the Gemara also. That's a natural connection to other Masechta.
Yep. Okay, this is nice. Liba says the Sabbath bride, right? Shabbat is like a bride. So that's a nice thematic link. Yeah, I don't know if that's going to show up so much in the legal discussions exactly, but it's certainly a lovely thematic link to Shabbat.
Right. I actually wonder, in my search, I did a little reading to some of the commentators who made these comments, and what strikes me in the sources of the people who actually gave Ketubot this nickname, it seems to be more descriptive, meaning when you look at the Talmud and you see it happens that in Ketubot there are all these topics, and so the question like why is a great question in terms of curiosity, and it might not be. I like a lot of the metaphors we're seeing in these answers, but it's possible the answer is it just turned out that way. Masechet Ketubot, right? Masechet Ketubot was one of the Masechtot that was studied more frequently, like the Geonim report. Like it was more frequently studied in the academies in Babylonia, and because it was more studied, there was more opportunity for people to bring other examples from other places into the conversation that then became part of the text. Whereas some of the Masechtot that weren't studied as much don't have as many layers or as many layers of conversation. So it could be because Ketubot was something that people had to learn, the richness of the conversation in the Beit Midrash that studied Talmud and produced later layers of the Talmud made it a more sophisticated text with more references because they were engaged in it more, and other things that they didn't touch didn't develop that way.
Yep.
But I love that question. Why, right? The curiosity is really good. And I wonder also, like, when we get a chance to see it, at the end of the Masachet, that, like, why is this, is it the right name? Why do we think it happened now? And how much did we learn about the rest of the Talmud? We can evaluate if it's the right name when we get to the end of Masachet. Something to think about over the next couple of months.
Yeah. I want to respond to Pamela's comment that it includes both societal law and religious law. So, Pamela, I imagine you're drawing a distinction between laws for the ritual of Israel versus laws that are like what we might think of as more secular, like laws for, what you do in the case of a theft, damages, things like that. And one thing I think will be really interesting for us to think about, especially as we move into, we've mostly been in things that are sort of obviously religious, but now we're moving into things that feel less obviously religious, like marriage contract. And then after we move through Nashim, we'll then get to the next order of the tractate, which is Nizikim, that's damages. That's sort of what's the word for it? I'm losing it.
It's all civil law.
It's all civil law. I think an interesting thing for us to keep in mind is, to us, there's a strong distinction. I think the thing you want to ask yourself as we do this is there such a strong distinction for the rabbis? Because I'm not sure there really is. I think for them, it's all God's law. All of it together. And for them, there isn't a strong distinction. But for us, we do definitely think in those categories. So that's always an interesting thing to think about as we move through.
Right. Well, especially since in our day, the civil law in the state we live in replaces Jewish civil law by Jewish law. That's a whole different conversation. But there's a principle, Dina de Malchuta Dina, the law of the land is the law you should follow. And in not all Jewish communities, there's some Jewish communities that still have their own courts for damage, for civil suits. But mostly in Jewish society in our day, Jewish civil law is suspended for civil law in the country that people live in. But religious law still, applies. But for the rabbis, it was more one and the same, even though they had to deal with Roman law and Babylonian laws while trying to maintain their own civil law in their own society.
And in antiquity, Jews often did have more enforcement power, right? We don't think of like rabbis as being enforcers these days. They're spiritual leaders, but not necessarily, there aren't police who are going to back up the rabbi's rulings, right? But in ancient society, when things were more decentralized, and especially in times when Jews had autonomy, but even when there was another ruling power, they still would often have autonomy over their small communities, and there would be power to enforce these laws in a different way.
Yeah.
Sometimes not. That's actually a hot debate in the scholarship, is how much power the rabbis had to enforce any of this. So
there we go.
All right. So it's 10 o'clock. Actually, it's 10:04. So we should probably call this. Thank you, Rabbi Goldberg, for bringing all those interesting sources and that framing for us to think about as we move through this tractate. Thank you, all of you, for your participation in the discussion and your interesting comments. And I apologize if we didn't quite get to all of them. And we're going to call it here. And we'll see you all in your inbox tomorrow and in Zoom next week. Yeah.
Take care, everybody. And Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi Goldberg. See you guys soon. Bye.